English 210 again. I'm going to talk this week about the readings for this week. So, one by one, we'll go through them. To read Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life is to see firsthand the realities of slavery, realities that had been either created or permitted to persist. The deconstruction of the black family, the forced labor and prostitution of slaves, the denial of access to community, the denial of access to knowledge, and as a consequence, the denial of intellectual development, the denial of choice and personal actuation, and as a consequence, not only the denial of personal development, but also the graduate inculcation of the belief that things could not and should not change. Frederick Douglass was one slave for whom all these denials were not persuasive. He wasn't the only one, but he's the one we have a real description of the processes that he went through in order to escape. His narrative recounts the gradual awakening of his sense of self and his determined acquisition of the weapons to fight against losing it. Two things I want you, as students who have not been browbeaten into a belief that you have no worth or agency in the world, to notice particularly: Douglass's clear realization that the ability to read was the fundamental key to freedom, and the force, eloquence, and elegance with which he writes. The self he built was a man whose speeches and writings could move thousands of hearts and minds, who knew and had lived what he was talking about, who was at ease telling crowds of people, mostly white, what to do and why, whose life was an example, should they need one, of what a black person could do with access to the same tools and opportunities that white people took for granted. As a personal note, which you know I can't resist, a fellow alum from Dickinson College has built a professional acting career partly on a one-man show in which he embodies Frederick Douglass, and closer to myself, I have visited the grave of Douglass in Mount Hope Cemetery, which is in Rochester, New York, where I went to graduate school. I was no longer living in Rochester on the day that many people chose to celebrate the 2008 election of President Barack Obama by visiting Douglass's grave and leaving flowers, balloons, letters, and poems on the stone to share their joy. So make sure you have read the narrative. Here, by the way, is one of those poems, which I read to you by permission of the author, Martin Espada, and can send you at your request by the same permission. Sorry in advance, you know I'm going to cry. That's what literature is supposed to do, move you. His poem is Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass, Mount Hope Cemetery, Rochester, New York, November 7th, 2008. This is the longitude and latitude of the impossible. This is the epicenter of the unthinkable. This is the crossroads of the unimaginable, the tomb of Frederick Douglass 3 days after the election. This is a world spinning away from the gravity of centuries, where the grave of a fugitive slave has become an altar. This is the tomb of a man born as chattel, who taught himself to read in secret, scraping the letters in his name with chalk on wood. Now on the anvil flat stone, a campaign button fills the O in Douglass. The button says Obama. This is the tomb of a man in chains who left his fingerprints on the slave breaker's throat so the whip would never carve his back again. Now a labor union t-shirt drapes itself across the stone, offered up by a nurse, a janitor, a bus driver. A sticker on the sleeve says, I voted today. This is the tomb of a man who rolled his call to arms off the press, peering through spectacles at the abolitionist headline, now in newspaper spreads above his dates of birth and death. The headline says, Obama wins. This is the stillness at the heart of the storm that began in the body of the first slave dragged aboard the first ship to America. Yellow leaves descend in waves, and the newspaper flutters on the tomb, like the sails Douglass saw in the bay, like the eyes of a slave closing to watch himself escape with the tide. Believers in spirits would see the pages trembling on the stone and say, look how the slave boy teaches himself to read. I say a prayer, the first in years, that here we bury what we call the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, now and forever. Amen. Again, his name is Martin Espada. And again, if you want a copy of that poem, just let me know. Moving on to Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley had the good fortune to grow up in Boston and in a white family that saw and appreciated her promise and made sure she not only learned to read, but also was provided with great literature to read, both English poets such as Milton and classical Latin poetry, and the kind of education available to the daughters of fine families of the day. She celebrates this good fortune in her poem on being brought from Africa to America. John and Susanna Wheatley sent her to London in the company of their son as a member of their family to arrange for the publication of her first book. The Wheatleys were, as our editor tells us, part of a community that saw slavery as unchristian, and Wheatley was freed a few months before Susanna died. John died 4 years later. Your textbook introduction will tell you that her life became harder after an unfortunate marriage, which in those days could indeed be another kind of bondage. As with a number of other writers of her day, she has gained full recognition for her work only recently. Our editor calls her a bold and canny spokesman for her faith and her politics, who argued that the exercise of slavery cannot be reconciled with a principle that God has implanted in every human breast, love of freedom. Longfellow's poem, The Slave's Dream, first published in 1842, is another of his poems wherein he uses his imagination to contemplate and enter the life of someone living a life greatly different from his own. It seems to us today rather sentimentalized, but the point it makes cannot be disputed, and Longfellow's sympathy for his subject is clear and compelling. He describes an unknown field slave lying amid the unharvested crop, quote, his sickle in his hand. The dream Longfellow presents is a memory and vision experienced in the mist and shadow, seemingly of exhausted sleep. The dream is first of his wife and children, a sight that makes him weep. Then he sees himself a king in the lands along the Niger River, galloping on his richly bridled stallion through a tropical landscape of flamingos and lions, where the forests with their myriad tongues shouted of liberty. And he smiles in his sleep. Longfellow ends with a stanza that reveals the slave's own freedom. Death had illumined the land of sleep. We sometimes hear the body called the soul's house, or even the soul's prison, and Longfellow uses that image to imply his own view of the realities of slavery in America, calling the slave's lifeless body a worn-out fetter, meaning chain, that the soul had broken and thrown away. In other words, where slavery is practiced, freedom comes only with death. Of this week's writers, Crèvecoeur was what we can legitimately call an outsider. Wheatley and Longfellow lived in Boston. Thoreau lived in Concord near Boston, and Douglass lived in bondage in the South and in freedom in the North, including New York, Boston, and Rochester. That is, this week we are in the generally anti-slavery North. Because of that fact, because of Thoreau's friendship with Emerson, and because of Thoreau's personal convictions, resistance to civil government should come as no surprise to us. Thoreau presented his speech, Resistance to Civil Government, in 1848 and published the version we have in 1849. What he was advocating resisting, and what he went to jail overnight for to protest, was the United States' declaration of war against Mexico under President Polk. Have you ever heard of him? In the name of manifest destiny, and by implication in order to increase the number of slave states by annexing Texas and other lands in the South. Thoreau and others opposed the war as unjust in many ways. Among his arguments was that soldiers sent to fight for something they do not understand or benefit from is a kind of slavery. A U.S. war is financed by the U.S. Treasury, which is sustained by taxation. Resistance to civil government is Thoreau's explanation of why the war was wrong and why citizens had to resist. He argues that the only tangible and measurable bond connecting the people and the government was the paying of taxes, and so refusing to pay a tax would be an act of defiance, as well as a refusal of tangible support for the war. but that act has to be public, or it cannot attract others to resist as well, and failure to pay taxes is subject to imprisonment. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. The influence of such a man would not be lost. Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence. If the alternative is to keep all just men in prison or give up war and slavery, the state will not hesitate which to choose. This is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution. If the law is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. In 1850, when the Massachusetts government signed on to the Fugitive Slave Act, a national law that required that any runaway slave had to be returned to his master, even if the slave had run as far as the non-slavery North, land of freedom, Massachusetts had again taken a position contrary to its citizens' beliefs. Although Thoreau didn't go to prison again, he made some of these same arguments in resistance to that law. And in fact, this essay and its advocacy of nonviolent resistance was an influence in the 1900s on Mahatma Gandhi in his crusade for India's independence from Great Britain, and Martin Luther King, Jr. in his leadership of the Civil Rights Movement. Put these readings all together and let them sink in, for you, a New Englander, were in the minds of all these New England writers as the inheritor of their search for an authentic life. That is the lecture for the day. I'll be emailing you as well.